Good morning. Ready to rock? Yes. It's an honor and a privilege to follow and precede so many wonderful people at this podium. And I owe a particular debt to Wyatt and my wonderful colleagues here. Thanks to, in large measure to them, I have a small new book, The Hidden Machinery, Essays on Writing. The book has a very simple premise. The premise is that the works of art we love are powered by a hidden machinery, that it is the job of the artist to conceal and the apprentice to apprehend or comprehend, whatever word you choose to use. And the origins of this project really are the incredibly, unbelievably, preposterously bad novel I wrote when I was 21. When I very, very painfully over 3 days reread the novel, one of the most startling things about it was how entirely I had failed to be influenced by the books I loved. So this is The Hidden Machinery is my attempt to redress that. And I just want to read you a brief quotation from E.M. Forster, an essay he published in 1925, Anonymity and Inquiry. Forster writes, and you must remember Forster was the most private of writers who sealed his papers for 50 years after his death. The personality of the writer, Forster writes, does become important after we have read his book and begin to study it. When the glamour of creation ceases, when the leaves of the divine tree are silent, when the co-partnership between writer and reader is over, then a book changes its nature, and we can ask ourselves questions about it, such as, what is the author's name? Where did he live? Was he married? Which was his favorite flower? Study is only a serious form of gossip. And in that spirit today, I'm reading you my essay, Gustav and Emma, Finding the First Novel. The handout contains almost all of Flaubert's wonderful bon mots. And I don't have Amy's directive about looking up and speaking out, but I'm trying to do it anyway. Gustav and Emma, Finding the First Novel. 2 epigraphs. The first, a definition: artists, all hoaxers. This was from Flaubert's ongoing project, a dictionary of received ideas. And the second, from a letter he wrote several years after finishing and publishing Madame Bovary. For me, a book has always only been a way of living in some particular milieu. That is what explains my hesitations, my anguish, and my slowness. And I'm afraid this essay has a certain slowness to it, so lunch at the moment is a very distant prospect. Just focus on those beautiful quotations. 1. Emma Bovary would surely never have behaved as she did if she had read the novel that bears her name. But Charles Bovary, such is his feeling for her, might have. Or so it seems to me upon rereading the novel they share. Much has shifted in my own life during the decades since I first met them, and much has shifted in the novel. The rooms are the same, but the views from the windows have vastly altered. Windows are important to Emma. Over and over she is depicted looking out, longing. Sometimes she sees a man she loves, Charles, Léon, Rodolphe, Léon again. But mostly what meets her gaze is the boredom of her father's farm, or the dreary village of Tostes, or the initially more promising town of Yonville. One of the great scenes in the novel, the courtship between Rodolphe and Emma, is set at a window in the town hall where they sit looking down on the agricultural fair. I too, as I first read these pages, found myself looking out of windows, longing. I had only just begun to write. Reading was all about pleasure, about having a wider world. I still, and this seems really strange now, I still had no concept of learning from the novels I loved. I gave myself over to Emma's ardors and despairs and entirely failed to notice how expertly Flaubert structures the novel, how deftly he moves the reader from one point of view to the next, how conscious he is of imagery and patterns, and how clearly he foreshadows the main events. Not only did I not understand how the novel worked its magic, I also knew little about its author, or why we might consider him our first modern novelist. I knew he was French, that the novel had been published in the 1850s, that Henry James had called Flaubert a novelist's novelist. I was aware of some of his sweeping claims. A writer, and I forgive, they're all cast in the masculine, but you'll hear them in my voice, so that makes it better. A writer should be in his work as God is in the physical universe, everywhere present and nowhere visible. The only truth in the world is a well-made sentence. Art requires a priestly devotion, and in his own case, I would add family money. But I knew almost nothing about his life and how he had come to write such a magnificent first novel. Nor did I know the degree to which the novel was the fruit of his devoted friendship with Louis Bouilhet, a poet and playwright. Novelists did not at that time have agents or editors to advise them. Most worked in solitude, and the novels were either rejected or published. Flaubert was a deeply fortunate exception. Bouilhet urged him towards the subject matter of Madame Bovary and visited almost every weekend to pore over the week's pages, usually no more than 4 or 5, and suggest cuts, additions, and revisions. We all need a Louis Bouilhet. Neither my inability to read more deeply nor my ignorance of Flaubert's life and methods diminished my enthusiasm for the novel, but they did limit what I learned from that first encounter. Reading the novel again in Lydia Davis's penetrating translation, and I should say that Madame Bovary is one of the most translated novels of the 19th century. Reading Lydia Davis's translation, knowing what I do now about both writing and Flaubert, I felt perhaps a little of what his most famous protégé, Guy de Maupassant, must have felt. Here was a writer whose every page has something to teach me. When I reached the end, I was also struck by how much there is to learn from the way in which Flaubert drew on his own experiences in writing Madame Bovary. The connection between craft and autobiography is one that almost invariably interests readers, and yet remains, perhaps rightly, confusing for authors. While we recognize the superficial sources of our material, we're often among the last to apprehend the deeper psychic impulses that draw us to it. In the case of Madame Bovary, the plot came from a well-known local scandal. Delphine Delamere, what a great name, Delphine Delamere, the second wife of a health officer, had committed adultery, squandered her husband's money, and then poisoned herself. Flaubert already knew about the Delamers when Bouilhet suggested them as the subject of his next novel, but whether either man understood the degree to which Flaubert's history and his nature would make him the ideal person to tell their story is a mystery. First among Flaubert's qualifications was his lifelong acquaintance with medical matters. Both his father and his older brother, the ambitiously named Achilles, were doctors, and Flaubert grew up around the hospital in Rouen. Charles Bovary's profession and two of the main events in the novel, the disastrous operation on the stable boy and Emma's taking arsenic, owe much to this early familiarity with medicine. Perhaps the operation also owes something to the final illness of Flaubert's father. In November 1845, he complained of a pain in his thigh. It turned out to be an abscess. When other treatments failed, Achilles operated. The result was infection, gangrene, agony, and in January 1846, death. Flaubert's relationship with adultery was also of long standing. At the age of 15, while on holiday with his family at Trouville, he met an older married woman, Elisa Schlesinger. Their unconsummated relationship became one of the lodestars of his life. The following year, he wrote Passion and Virtue, a philosophical tale, about a married woman, Maza, who daydreams about Ernest, a man she has seen at the Comédie Française. Ernest is utterly unworthy of her daydreams, but he was an expert seducer. He knew by heart the devices, the tricks. Maza gives herself to him, body and soul, only to have him flee to Mexico. When her repulsive husband conveniently dies a few months later, she writes to Ernest. He writes back that he is already married, and she takes poison. 15 years later, Rodolphe, Emma's first lover, talks and thinks like Ernest, while Emma shares Maza's romantic daydreams. More immediately, Madame Bovary was influenced by Flaubert's relationship with the poet Louise Collet, whom he met in 1846. She lived with her daughter in Paris. She was separated from her husband, and even at the height of their relationship, the two seldom met. With some justice, Louise complained that Flaubert would rather write to her than make love to her. We are the happy beneficiaries of his preference. Their ardent correspondence contains much of what we know about his working methods, and the character of Emma, as Flaubert, Bouillet, and Louise each acknowledged, owes much to his mistress. Several critics, beginning with Baudelaire and including Jean-Paul Sartre, have described Emma as a feminized man. She's too vigorous, too passionate, too active, they claim, to be a woman. But Flaubert knew better. She is modeled on Collet, who gave gifts, initiated meetings, made demands, and once even showed up at his family home without invitation. While Lisa Schlesinger's and Louise Collet's roles in Madame Bovary are obvious, that of Flaubert's other lodestar, Alfred Le Poitevin, is less so. The two were family friends who became close when Le Poitevin was studying for his entrance exams to law school. It's interesting that law school, then as now, was the destination of aspiring writers. Flaubert fell utterly under the older boy's spell. "We are ordained by Providence," he wrote, "to think and feel in harmony." Le Poitevin was a romantic of the highest order. The world is illusion, the past is infinitely superior to the present, man is a helpless toy in the hands of God. The life of the bourgeois, of idées reçues, is meaningless. Alfred studied law to please his father, got married. "You're doing something abnormal," Flaubert wrote, to please his family. But finally, Le Poitevin believed that to struggle against fate was useless. On April 3rd, 1848, with Flaubert at his bedside, he stopped struggling altogether. Flaubert never forgot his friend and never entirely relinquished those romantic ideals. Flaubert's own health was a significant factor in his life and work. Like Le Poitevin, he was destined to become a lawyer. Then, during his first year of study, he had a seizure, lost consciousness, and fell out of a carriage. What a great thing. His parents brought him home, and any idea of his practicing law was abandoned. They purchased a house in the village of Croisset, where Flaubert lived and wrote for most of his life. The seizures, and we don't have a precise diagnosis, they were similar to epilepsy but without the convulsions, gradually grew less frequent, but during them Flaubert experienced moments of intense awareness. He wrote, "I have an extraordinary faculty of perception, and sometimes by dint of gazing at a pebble, an animal, a picture, I felt myself enter into them." As readers, we glimpse this gift in such passages as this one describing an early meeting between Charles and Emma. "Once, during a thaw, the bark of the trees was oozing in the yard, the snow on the tops of the buildings was melting. She was on the doorsill. She went to get her parasol. She opened it. The parasol of dove-grey iridescent silk with the sun shining through it cast moving glimmers of light over the white skin of her face. She was smiling beneath it in the mild warmth, and they could hear the drops of water, one by one, falling on the taut moiré." Prior to embarking on his law studies, Flaubert had written not only his novella, Passion and Virtue, but also several other short narratives. Now that he was free, he devoted himself to writing and travel. Like many 19th century writers, the two went hand in hand for him, one providing the material and also perhaps the psychic space for the other. He wrote a book about exploring Brittany with his friend Maxime Duchamp, and early versions of two novels that he would later revise and publish, A Sentimental Education and The Temptation of St. Anthony. The Temptation was written at a furious pace in the 18 months following Le Poitevins' death, and is heavily influenced by their shared romantic ideals. In September 1849, over the course of 4 days, Flaubert read the entire manuscript, all 541 pages, aloud to Bouillet and Duchamp. He finished at close to midnight on the 4th day. Here is what Duchamp wrote. "Flaubert pounded his fist on the table. 'Now,' he cried, 'tell me frankly what you think.' Bouillet was naturally timid, but no one could express himself more fearlessly when he had once made up his mind to speak. It was he who replied, 'We think you should throw it into the fire and never speak of it again.'" Flaubert jumped from his chair with a cry of horror. The two friends argued with Flaubert for hours, pointing out the many problems in the novel. Finally, he took their words to heart. The Temptation joined its predecessors in the drawer. Only in the sense of publication was Madame Bovary his first novel. I mention these autobiographical facts, this gossip, if you will, as an element of Flaubert's craft, an element we can learn from. We always bring some part of ourselves to even our most purely imagined work. Awareness of this may or may not be helpful as we generate material, but as we begin to shape it, recognizing when and how our autobiographical sources are causing us to dwell at inappropriate length on certain moments, or alternatively, to give them short shrift, is crucial. We can see how Flaubert's intimacy with medical matters led him to write expansively about the stable boy's operation and Emma's slow death. In his original plan for the novel, there is no mention of the former, of the operation. About Emma, he writes, "Death agony, precise medical details, on such and such a day at 3 o'clock in the morning, her vomiting returned," etc. And of course, Homais, Charles and Emma's meddlesome neighbor in Yonville, became one of his favorite characters. "My pharmacist," he called him in letters. He cut many pages of his conversation, and for the modern reader's taste, might have cut still more. I don't advise Flaubert very often. Although Flaubert argued and protested when Bouillet first suggested that Delphine de la Mare should be the basis of his next novel, the story was too bourgeois, too vulgar. He was eventually persuaded. 5 years after he set to work, he declared Madame Bovary finished, and in the autumn of 1856, Duchamp offered to serialize it in the magazine he published, La Revue de Paris. The process of publication proved torturous, and at many points, Flaubert was ready to withdraw the novel. But finally, the date for the first installment was set. He wrote to Bouillet, "I lose my virginity as unpublished writer a week from Thursday, October 1st. May Fortuna Virilis be favorable to me." Fortuna was not, at least according to Flaubert. Numerous typographical errors had escaped the printers, but worse, much worse, was the sight of his prose in print. "It seems utterly flat to me," he wrote again to Bouillet. "Everything in it seems bad. This is literally true. It is a bitter disappointment, and the success of the book will have to be deafening indeed to cover the voice of my conscience, which keeps shouting, 'Failure, failure.'" But Bouillet, who had applied himself so assiduously to the novel, was vindicated. From its opening pages, Madame Bovary was a success, a novel that moved and excited readers. It also rapidly became a scandal. In an attempt to avoid being taken to court, the magazine, without telling Flaubert, cut the famous coach ride when Léon and Emma hurtle around the streets of Rouen, and in the last installment, despite his vehement objections, cut numerous scenes. But the censorship, as he predicted, made no difference. "You have seized upon the details," he wrote to the managing editor of the magazine, "whereas it is the book as a whole that is to blame. The brutal element is everywhere, not merely on the surface." In January 1857, Flaubert found himself in court charged with offending public morality and religion. All this was so upsetting that he was ready to put the novel away with the others in the drawer, until Bouillet reminded him that publication would allow him to restore the censored passages. Madame Bovary, dedicated to the lawyer who successfully defended it and to the faithful Bouillet, was published in its entirety in April 1857, to excellent sales and strong reviews. Was Flaubert at last pleased? Not entirely. "All this uproar around my first book," he wrote, "seems so irrelevant to art that it sickens me, it dazes me. How I miss the fish-like silence in which I had persisted until now." Later, he would also come to resent the success of his first novel, which overshadowed both then and now everything else he wrote. 2. Flaubert drew skillfully on his own life, listened to Bouillet, and worked hard, but none of these, as he knew, guaranteed success. In the aftermath of his failures, he became our first modern writer, working in a self-conscious way and acutely aware of what his prose could do for his vulgar plot. "Continuity constitutes style," he wrote, "as constancy makes for virtue." The famous voice did not come to him easily. "My novel is having a frightful time getting started," he wrote to Louise Collet. "I have abscesses of style. I itch with sentences that never appear. I'm so disconsolate about the whole thing that I greatly enjoy it. The tone in which I am steeping myself is so new to me that I keep opening my eyes in astonishment." This time he heeded Duchamp and Bouillet's advice that a perfect paragraph followed by a perfect paragraph followed by a perfect paragraph does not necessarily make 3 perfect paragraphs. A novel has to flow, the joints must not show. He also struggled with the banality of his characters' dialogue. Writing about the first meeting between Emma and Léon, he remarked that he thought it was the first time a novel had made fun of its leading man and lady. Irony, he added, takes nothing away from pathos. And he understood, at last, painfully, the need for relevance. The great Anglo-Irish novelist Elizabeth Bowen says, "The greatest sin in a novel is irrelevance." Every element in the novel must serve a purpose, ideally more than one. At Bouillet's urging, after several attempts, he wrote a plan. It focuses mostly on the ups and downs of Emma's love life. The ball of part 1 and the agricultural fair of part 2 are mentioned, but only a clause in the last paragraph, discovery of appalling debts, hints at the role money will play in her downfall. This search for externals, the need to find an outer life, a wardrobe, if you will, for our characters, is a common task. Whatever the starting point of a novel, a public or private story, a resonant image, a memory, as we write, we keep searching for ways to dramatize the inner lives of our characters. Long before T.S. Eliot urged the need for an objective correlative, an object or action to stand in for the emotions, Flaubert knew that he could not rely on the lyricism and imagery that had so fatally marred The Temptation. Emma's inner life must be revealed by the details of her world, by her actions, and by the many minor characters. Between my first and subsequent readings of Madame Bovary, I had remembered almost everything about Emma and her lovers, but I was shocked as I began to read again to find that the novel opens with Charles. Flaubert labored long and hard over the beginning. Everything about these pages was considered and reconsidered, including the detailed description of the extraordinary hat Charles is wearing when he arrives at school. And this is only a short part of the description. It was one of those headgears of a composite type in which one may recognize elements of the busby, the lancer shapska, the bowler, the otter-skin cap, and the cotton house cap, one of those sorry things indeed whose mute ugliness has depths of expression like the face of an imbecile. What kind of man is married to a woman who behaves like Emma? Flaubert answers this question promptly, showing Charles, an inept only child, oppressed first at home, then at school, then by his medical studies. After initially failing his exams, he becomes a medical officer. Flaubert was sensitive to the nuances, he isn't a doctor. His parents marry him to a much older widow, and he begins to practice in the village of Tostes. One day he is summoned to set a farmer's broken leg and meets the farmer's daughter, Emma. Typically unaware of his own longing, he begins to visit the farm. At breakneck speed, reminiscent of his novella Passion and Virtue, Flaubert describes how Charles's wife forbids his visits to the farm, how it emerges that she has lied about her fortune, and then she conveniently dies. This takes less than 3 pages. At first we see Emma as Charles does, in fragments, a shoulder here, a flounce there. Not until she is married and arrives at the house in Tostes do we see her whole enter her consciousness. On the desk by the window, she notices a bunch of orange flowers. It was a bridal bouquet, the other woman's bouquet. What will become of her own bouquet, Emma wonders dreamily, should she die? From then on, she is at the center of the novel, but we still, and again, this was a crucial decision on Flaubert's part, get Charles's point of view, as well as that of other characters and of our omniscient but non-interfering narrator. Here, for example, is Emma on her first evening in Yonville. The fire shone on her fully, penetrating with a raw light the weave of her dress, the regular pores of her white skin, and even her eyelids, which she closed from time to time. A bright red glow passed over her each time a gust of wind came through the half-open door. From the other side of the fireplace, a young man with fair hair was watching her in silence. Because he was very bored in Yonville, where he worked as a clerk for the lawyer Guillaume, Monsieur Léon Dupuis, and so on. We watch Emma, we see who is watching her, then we begin to learn about the watcher. In Flaubert's original plan for Madame Bovary, Léon plays a central role, but many other elements of the finished novel are missing. Only in the writing does he seem to have discovered the 3-part structure. Each part marks a change in setting. Within that structure, he makes another brilliant choice. In each part, he includes a large public event or space. In part 1, there is the ball to which Emma and Charles are invited, the life Emma longs for. In part 2, the agricultural fair, the life she's trying to flee. And in part 3, the cathedral that in her convent girlhood had seemed to promise a refuge. Each of these large public occasions advances the plot and helps to develop what Flaubert calls the different adventures of Emma's soul. Long before the ball, it is apparent that Emma and Charles are ill-suited. Charles, who has stoically endured his first marriage, is transformed by the continuous flow of happiness he finds in his second. But Emma, the romantic, is still searching for the marvelous passion she read about in novels at school. A great rosy-feathered bird hovering in the splendor of a poetical sky. Instead of a rosy bird, however, boredom, that silent spider, takes up residence. The ball, at which Emma enjoys great success, briefly rescues her. At one point, Flaubert considered having her infidelities begin that evening. His decision not to only renders more painful her glimpse of the life to which she feels she was born. In the aftermath of that glittering evening, she feigns illness and persuades Charles to leave Tostes, where his practice is beginning to do quite well, and move on to Yonville. In Yonville, Léon, with his own boredom, is waiting. Earlier novelists made use of juxtaposition. Jane Austen, as I'm sure you know, is particularly skillful at this. But Flaubert, committed to his belief that the author should not overtly comment on the action, relies frequently on this method of guiding the reader. Here are a few lines from the scene where Emma and Rodolphe are seated at the window looking down at the agricultural fair while the prizes are being awarded. A few days ago, for example, when I came to your house, Rodolphe says, to Monsieur Bizet of Quincampoix, did I know that I would be coming here with you? 70 francs. 100 times I've tried to leave you, and yet I've followed you. I've stayed with you. For manure. As I would stay with you tonight, tomorrow, every day, my whole life. To Monsieur Caron of Arguy, a gold medal. 10 pages later, when Rodolphe seduces Emma, Flaubert describes her as seeing the woods around them filled with beauty. Something sweet seemed to be coming from the trees. She could feel her blood flowing through her flesh like a river of milk. The lyrical paragraph ends with the sentence, Rodolphe, cigar between his teeth, mended with his penknife one of the bridles which was broken. Here's Flaubert pounding out those clauses like hitting a nail. Rodolphe, cigar between his teeth, mended with his penknife one of the bridles which was broken. In The Art of Fiction, John Gardner includes a list of exercises. One is to describe a barn from the point of view of a man who has just lost his son in the war without mentioning either the son or the war. Flaubert is a master of this technique, using specific details to create simultaneously the outer and the inner life. Here is Emma at the height of her despair in Tostes. But it was above all at mealtimes that she could not bear it any longer. In that little room on the ground floor, with the stove that smoked, the door that creaked, the walls that seeped, the damp flagstones, all the bitterness of life seemed to be served up on her plate, and with the steam from the boiled beef, there rose from the depths of her soul other gusts of revulsion. Charles took a long time eating. She would nibble a few walnuts, or, leaning on her elbow, pass the time drawing lines on the oilcloth with the tip of her knife. As he did earlier when describing Emma on the doorsill with Charles, Flaubert uses intense perceptions to convey intense emotions. Then the bark was oozing, the snow was melting, the world was full of possibility. Now the stove smokes, the door creaks, the walls seep. He catalogues the dreariness of that little room and its effect on Emma, yet he does so without suggesting that she is consciously making the catalogue. Although Flaubert knew Emma's fate before he embarked on the novel, it is crucial to the success of Madame Bovary that she does not enter easily into adultery. Over and over, she seeks to escape the choice she finally makes. One of the most obvious escape routes, motherhood, is blocked almost immediately. Emma arrives in Yonville pregnant and longing for a son. A man, at least, is free. He can explore every passion, every land, overcome obstacles, taste the most distant pleasures. But a woman is continually thwarted. There is always some desire luring her on, some convention holding her back. Of course, Emma means a rich man like Rodolphe. Poor Charles has never been free. When he breaks the news to her that they have a daughter, Emma faints. She christens the baby Bertha, a name she overheard at the ball, but she never grows fond of her. For the remainder of the novel, her daughter plays little part in her thoughts or her actions. Being a mother offers no safety, nor does the church on the 2 occasions when Emma explicitly asks for help. The first time is when she discovers that Léon loves her. She's thrilled, she trembles at the sound of his footsteps. She takes pride in being virtuous. She is tormented by desire and melancholy. In the hope that he will help her to resist temptation, she goes to talk to the curé. This is a long scene of 3 pages. "How are you faring?" the curé added. "Not well," answered Emma. "I'm in pain." "Why, so am I," replied the clergyman. "These first warm days weaken one terribly, don't they? Well, there's nothing to be done. We're born to suffer, as St. Paul says. But now, what does Monsieur Bovary think about this?" "Oh, him," she said, with a gesture of disdain. "What?" replied the simple man, quite surprised. "Hasn't he prescribed something for you?" "Ah," said Emma, "it isn't earthly remedies I need." This goes on for 2 more pages, and at last she gives up. "But you were asking me something, weren't you?" the curé says. "What was it? I can't remember." "Oh, nothing, nothing," Emma repeated. Even with no help from Bertha or the curé, she does manage to prevent Léon from making an explicit declaration. Not realizing that she shares his feelings, he wearies of her evasiveness and moves to Paris. Her next suitor, Rodolphe, is older, wealthier, coarser, and much more sophisticated. He has no qualms about using on Emma the tricks and locutions that have worked so well with previous mistresses. Despite her delight in his overtures, she still tries to resist. She refuses to go riding with him until Charles urges her to accept the invitation for the good of her health. And there, in the woods, she joins the lyrical host of adulterous women. But soon, again, she is looking for escape. As it becomes increasingly clear that Rodolphe's passion does not match hers, she ponders a surprising possibility. She even asked herself why she despised Charles and whether it would not be better if she could love him. Enter Homais, the pharmacist, with his suggestion that Charles operate on the stable boy's clubfoot. Charles is nervous about the prospect. His main accomplishment is not killing his patients. But Emma is optimistic. The operation will make him famous. What a satisfaction it would be for her to have started him on a path that would increase both his reputation and his fortune. All she wanted now was to be able to lean on something more solid than love. She does not love Charles, but if he became successful and could give her the life she wants, then maybe the rosy-feathered bird wouldn't matter so much. And Flaubert, who has written so eloquently about her longing for romance, respects this new feeling. Who wouldn't want to escape the spider of rural boredom? But the operation, although at first seeming a triumph, goes rapidly, horribly awry. A surgeon has to be called in to amputate Hippolyte's gangrenous leg. Charles is humiliated. As for Emma, Flaubert offers this chilling comment. She did not share Charles's humiliation. She was experiencing a humiliation of a different sort, that she had imagined such a man could be worth something. The operation, taking place as it does almost exactly halfway through the novel, is the keystone of the adventures of her soul. In the aftermath, her efforts to escape her lovers are increasingly feeble. She starts borrowing money from Le Heureux, the Iago-like merchant, and she starts begging Rodolphe to take her away. But, said Rodolphe, what? What about your daughter? She pondered for a few moments, then answered, we'll take her, it can't be helped. What a woman, he said to himself as he watched her go away. In one of his piercing juxtapositions, Flaubert shows Charles a few pages later coming home to gaze fondly at Bertha in her cradle. The reader knows long before Emma does that Rodolphe will leave without her, and the suspense, as in most of the novel, comes from seeing not what will happen, but how. Rodolphe's farewell letter to Emma echoes Ernest's to Maza, written more than 15 years before. Each invents reasons for his flight and moralizes in a high-minded way. Fate is to blame, only fate, Rodolphe writes. There's a word that always has a nice effect, he said to himself. Indeed it does. Emma is ill for 43 days after she reads his letter. Flaubert is also a master of two familiar devices that have a long history of engaging the reader: failure and repetition. Remember all those fairy stories in which the heroine must knock 3 times or climb 7 hills or empty 10 lakes? Homais, who proposed the disastrous operation, now suggests that Charles take Madame to the opera in Rouen for the good of her health, and Emma, who refused to go riding with Rodolphe, refuses to go to the opera, only to have her objections once again overturned by Charles. When Charles goes to buy barley water in the interval and runs into Léon, their reunion has the force of the inevitable. The return of Léon rather than the introduction of a new lover is another example of the skillful use of repetition. Alone together at the beginning of part 3, Léon and Emma talk. Their conversation, similar to the ones they had when they met in part 2, reveals how much each has changed. The innocent clerk has followed in Rodolphe's footsteps, becoming bolder and more manipulative. He claims to have made a will in which he requests that he be buried in the beautiful coverlet Emma gave him when he lived in Yonville. They were both creating for themselves an ideal against which they were now adjusting their past lives. Besides, speech is a rolling press that always amplifies one's emotions. That's why Scottish people never speak. But after Léon leaves, Emma, knowing the danger she is in, makes one last effort to escape. She writes a letter explaining that they must never meet again, only to realize she has no address. She must deliver the letter in person at the place they have agreed to meet, the cathedral. This scene, part 3's counterpart to the ball and the agricultural fair, is developed in vivid detail, first from Léon's point of view as he waits for her. The church, like a vast boudoir, was arranging itself around her. Then, when she at last appears in a rustle of silk and thrusts the letter into his hands, from Emma's. In the Lady Chapel, she prays for divine assistance. Briefly, it appears in the form of a loquacious verger who is eager to give them a tour of the cathedral. But Léon can brook no further delay. Fearing that his love will evaporate, he extricates them from the verger's speeches and summons a carriage. And of course, what follows is probably the most famous sex scene in 19th and perhaps 19th and 20th century literature. We're not permitted to enter the carriage during that famous ride. Instead, we see the coachman's weariness. "Keep going," Léon shouts whenever he tries to stop. and the townspeople wide-eyed in amazement as this thing so unheard of in the provinces, a carriage with drawn blinds that kept appearing and reappearing, sealed tighter than a tomb and tossed about like a ship at sea. We have one glimpse of Emma. Her hand appears beneath the blind to throw out some scraps of white paper, which at once scatter like butterflies on the wind. So much for her letter to Léon. The white butterflies in turn carry us back to the end of part 1, when Emma, packing to leave Tostes, discovers her wedding bouquet in a drawer and throws it on the fire. The bouquet burns first quickly, then slowly, and the shriveled paper petals hovering along the fire like black butterflies at last flew away up the chimney. There is a risk to this kind of repeated imagery, that of the world seeming too well organized, sealed tighter than a tomb against the interruptions of life. But for the most part, Flaubert avoids this by ensuring that each image is organic to the plot and to the setting. The wedding, only a few more pages to go. The wedding bouquets, the damp walls and oozing trees, the cemetery and the pharmacy and the river and the garden, and the lathe of Binet, the tax collector, all help to bring Madame Bovary to life. How can we question the actions of characters who inhabit such a palpable world? When Bouillet was urging Flaubert to write the story of the Delamères, he also urged him to set it in Normandy, the region he knew so well. Happily, Flaubert listened, and the result is a shimmering example of how much setting can accomplish for a work of fiction. The sharply specific details of Tostes, Yonville, and Rouen enable him to get away with flagrant coincidences, obvious foreshadowings, and that occasional overuse of patterning. How skillfully Flaubert depicts the withering of Emma's hopes. In Adultery, he writes, she has rediscovered the platitudes of marriage. What could be more distressing? And we, her readers, discover what we should have known all along, that Emma's lovers have only ever been a way of trying to find the life, the intensity she craves. She has indeed been on a journey of the soul. In Léon's company, she attends a masked ball in Rouen. Afterwards, at supper, it's nearly dawn by this time, she realizes with dismay that all the other women are of the lowest class. What a contrast to the glorious ball of part 1. Everything, she thinks, even she herself, was unbearable. She wished she could escape like a bird and grow young again, somewhere far, far away in the immaculate reaches of space. When she arrives home the next afternoon, a summons is waiting. Within 24 hours, she must pay 8,000 francs. In a fashion eerily reminiscent of her fatal carriage ride with Léon, Emma dashes round and round, searching for the money. She goes to see Le Heureux, the merchant, and finds him adamant, even when she makes a pass. She calls on the bankers she knows. She begs Léon, who fobs her off by promising to approach a wealthy friend. She goes to see Monsieur Guillaumin, the notary, and rebuffs his pass. She even visits the tax collector. And all the time, the knowledge that Charles will forgive her only makes her more furious. Even if he gave me 1 million, it wouldn't be enough to make me forgive him for knowing me, she thinks. At last, she remembers Rodolphe, and as she had done in happier days, she walks across the fields to his house. The conversation that follows, one of the longest in the novel, is by turns romantic, tender, mendacious, and furious, a model of desperate dialogue. Just as the white butterflies of the letter carry us back to the black butterflies of the bouquet, so Emma's return to Yonville as she runs back across the fields return us to that glittering night at the ball when, going down the stairs at the chateau, she resists the impulse to run. In the pharmacy, she finds Justin, the pharmacist's assistant, who has loved her silently all along. Question: why does there have to be a Justin in the novel? answer so that Emma can get into the locked room and eat arsenic. The brutal elements of the novel, as Flaubert said, are everywhere. Flaubert was a modern novelist not only because of his failures, his ambition, and his self-consciousness, but also because he knew the value of research. He took notes at an agricultural fair, investigated the process of loans and debts, and planned Emma's wardrobe. Nowhere is his research more evident than in her prolonged death scene, the final adventure of her soul, a sequence unlike any that had previously appeared in fiction, one that many novelists would, I think, in its graphic physical detail and relentless hopelessness, still hesitate to write. The novel ends, as it begins, with Charles. He does forgive her everything: debt, infidelity, her neglect of him and of their daughter. He even forgives Rodolphe, and in a moment of almost unbearable irony, offers him the excuse that Rodolphe offered Emma in his farewell letter. Fate is to blame. When I first read the novel years ago, I mostly agreed with Rodolphe's assessment of Charles, comical even, and rather low. Now, Charles's love for Emma seems like a stream of pure and constant feeling running through the novel, a river of milk which survives every iniquity. Yes, I was right to think that he might, knowing everything, still have married her. But I was wrong to believe happiness ever lay within his grasp. He is, after all, a character in a novel by Flaubert. It is strange, Flaubert wrote, how I was born with little faith in happiness. At the earliest age, I had a complete foretaste of life. It was like a nauseous kitchen odor leaking out through the transom. In the miasma of that odor, Flaubert wrote a novel that combines the vivid use of realism with the taut structure, repetitions, and reversals of a three-act drama. And because he never loses sympathy with either of his main characters, this union, unlike Charles and Emma's marriage, is almost wholly successful. Flaubert was an uneasy realist. He never forgot Le Poitevin's romanticism, but no one has made better use of the technique. When years later, to please his fellow novelist Georges Sand, he wrote A Simple Heart, he borrowed a stuffed parrot to make sure he did justice to Lulu before finally turning him into the Holy Ghost. And I think you can still see the parrot in a museum in Rouen, a little the worse for wear. His precise details made possible, His precise details made possible extremity of action, thought, and emotion. As Emma and Rodolphe watch the fair from the window, and Rodolphe offers the romantic clichés that have proved so effective with other mistresses, an elderly servant is awarded a silver medal for 54 years of service on the same farm. Flaubert devotes a long paragraph to Catherine Nice's Elizabeth Leroux as she approaches the platform. Here is his description of her hands. Barn dust, caustic washing soda, and wool grease had so thoroughly encrusted, chafed, and hardened them that they seemed dirty, even though they had been washed in clear water. And from the habit of serving, they remained half open, as though offering their own testimony to the great suffering they had endured. Thank you.